Good morning, everybody. Um, as uh, Bill talked about, each year it seems more and more resources are put into fence modification projects with the aim of improving landscape connectivity for wildlife. And most of these mitigation projects focus on, a particular fence line that runs through a corridor or a private parcel where a landowner is willing to make a change. This case study I'm about to talk about is a little bit different. I think first because it involves both public and private land. And secondly, just the sheer scale and magnitude of this fence problem we have in the Red Desert. It's really astonishing. So, at the direction of the Game and Fish Department, we conducted a 3-year GPS study in the Red Desert Herd Unit, where we collected about 325,000 locations from 45 pronghorn. Now, the original goal of this study was just to evaluate pronghorn interchange among hunt areas and herd units. But whenever pronghorn are involved, it seems like it's common that movement barriers become the focus of the study, especially once all the data are collected. And that was the case with this study as well. Now, we expected the interstate I-80 and highways to block pronghorn movements, which is common across the state, but the extent of the fence barriers and the associated habitat loss was not expected. We ended up identifying more than 100,000 acres of winter range and year-round habitat that was inaccessible to pronghorn because of livestock fencing. You can see some of those blocks there in yellow. We also identified a lot of other fence lines that were impermeable but could be accessed from one side or the other. And some of those are highlighted in green. And just a mental note, that square block there is 16 sections, and Amy Anderson will be talking about that a little bit later. Now, most of the problematic fences in the desert were woven wire like this one, left over from earlier decades when the sheep industry in that part of the state was booming. So, of course, not having access to large swaths of habitat and having to move around hundreds of miles of impermeable fence makes life difficult for pronghorn anytime. But when we get a winter like the one we had in 2022-23, it's really devastating. Give you a sense of what snowpack looked like out there that winter compared to the previous 20 years. On the right, the snow models show that those pronghorn were exposed to more than 100 days of snow depths that were over a foot. So just an extraordinary amount of snow, and the duration of that snowpack lasted a long time. So with the help of Ellen Akins and Jared Merkel and Wenjing Zhu, we were able to take a closer look at these data and see how fences and other barriers affected pronghorn movement and mortality that winter. When the heavy snows arrive, pronghorn can't stay where they're at, and so they rely on what we call escape movements to seek out areas with less snow. And here's just an example of a resident animal. And again, this is 3 years of data, so it basically spent 2 years in this one pasture, a pretty large fenced pasture. When the snows hit, it tried to make a run to the east, and it got a little ways, but you can see it got hung up in other fences for a few weeks, couldn't really move anywhere, ended up dying. Giving an example of a migratory animal, you can see its normal summer and winter ranges and migration routes. But then when the snows hit that year, it took off to the south and the east, bounced around in some fences, moved around those fence blocks, ended up down by I-80 once and moved back around, hit I-80 again, then started moving back up to the north and west. And after more than 60 days and over 225 miles, it perished as well. Now, among these individuals, the key to surviving was initiating these escape movements early and not being delayed by barriers, specifically fences and roads. Fences delayed these escape movements. And when pronghorn escape movements were delayed, they spent more time in deep snow, and that led to much higher mortality rates compared to individuals that were not delayed. Now, I think a common perception and narrative here is that these mass mortality events are just unavoidable when we have a bad winter. But this study really makes a compelling case that mortality rates would have been much, much lower with fewer barriers on the landscape. And as it was, we lost more than 50% of the adult population. If you're interested in more details on this, I put this paper in the chat. And so in closing, we've really identified enough problem fences just in the Red Desert herd unit alone, I think, to keep us busy for the next decade or so. But in doing so, we hope to have highlighted why connected landscapes are so important and why they are even more important now as severe droughts and severe winters become more and more common, and specifically the role connectivity can play in minimizing these mass mortality events that in the past we've often just thought of as unavoidable. And with that, hopefully I kept to my 7 minutes there, Andrew. If there's any questions, I can try to answer them.
Thanks, Hall. You're right on time. There is a question in the chat box. Is anyone sharing this with RSGA?
That's a good question. I might defer to Amy since she's on here.
So we worked with the Rock Springs Grazing Association a bit with the development of the first phase of the Red Desert Fence Initiative. So they are aware of the issues. And as most of you know, Don Schramm is a member of that grazing association, and he's also on the WWNRT board. So yeah, they know what's going on. But hopefully we'll be able to partner with them more moving forward.
Question for Paul or any of the presenters moving forward, just please raise your hand with that reaction function.
All right. Well, thanks. If anybody has questions, feel free to follow up with me, or Amy's going to show you some of the follow-up success stories out here shortly.
Thanks, Hall. Appreciate that. We're actually doing pretty well on time. We'll go ahead and start the next presentation. I'd like to invite Luke Wilde with the University of Wyoming. Take it away, Luke.
Great, thanks, Andrew. Hi, everyone. I'm a PhD student in Matt Kaufman's lab, and talk about some of the functional benefits of fence modification for mule deer. And so as Hall and Bill and Andrew in introducing this summit really laid out, the American West and really globally, there's many barriers to movement. And we know that migration is crucial for animals. Escape movements like what Hall just mentioned can be crucial for animals. And so these barriers pose a significant problem. However, after a couple decades of looking into these barriers, researchers were able to start to talk about some of the more sort of nuanced effects that barriers can have. And one of these is what's referred to as functional habitat. So in my title slide, I referred to the functional benefits. And so here we'll just kind of lay out what we're referring to. And so you can imagine that an animal finds suitable habitat when the biotic and abiotic conditions are just right, but it only becomes functional habitat if that same animal can access it through movement. So this really piggybacks off of what Hall was just saying about pronghorn being able to evade harsh winter events. And that's only fitting because Hall and colleagues in 2013 provided a really great paradigm for understanding functionality and when function is maintained across barrier permeability. And so here, from left to right, we see a permeability gradient of impermeable barriers moving over to semi-permeable barriers. And only at those really semi-permeable barriers does this paradigm recognize that the functional attributes are kept intact. And so when animals are able to connect landscapes, they're able to use the stopovers or foraging sites that they want. They're able to access birthing sites and maybe even avoid predators. And so this paradigm has been really powerful and has started to be applied in many areas. However, one area that it still has needs a little bit more attention is with fences. And so as this summit is focused on fences, we know that it's a major problem. And Bill laid out clearly how fences can pose a direct mortality risk, but they can also cause issues such as behavioral alteration and even the separation of family groups shown here. And Wyoming has really put its dollar behind this, and thanks to the work of the Upper Green Fence Initiative led by Troy and Jill, as well as Sublette County Conservation District and NRCS, there's been massive efforts in modifying fences throughout the Upper Green Valley, especially here with a lot of focus being on the Red Desert to Hoback high use corridor. And so many of you will recognize that name, the Red Desert to Hoback, as the longest mule deer migration in the United States. And so we wanted to set out and ask, how have these modifications benefited mule deer in terms of the functionality of their migration? And so this project began with the efforts of Hall Sawyer back in 2011 and Anna Ortega then from 2016 to 2021. And with their collective efforts and the work that we've been doing since, we've been able to monitor 390 animals moving through this corridor, and that accounts for nearly 1,000 animal years. So the first thing we really wanted to do is just see if we couldn't quantify the treatment effects. How much does on the ground change to a fence end up relating to what a deer actually experiences? And what we found was pretty good news. On average, we were seeing that deer experienced about 8 fewer fences per year since 2011. And so by my calculations, that meant that on average, deer were experiencing 58% fewer fences than they were 15 years ago. So if we look at this then across the high use corridor itself, here we can imagine Highway 28 down on the left on the x-axis and the Hoback Junction on the far right. And then as we go up on that y-axis, it means that there's more fences per unit area. And so we can just kind of think of this as a deer would move through. And so this gray line is where fences were initially when this migration was first described. And I'm showing each year how we actually see these declines. And so this graph really points out some of the amazing success areas, such as Silver Creek, Scab Creek, Pole Creek, Willow to New Fork, that sort of section of bottlenecking. And then the Green River to Rim Road subdivisions have all seen massive reductions over the last decade in where fences are on the landscape. However, it also can draw some attention to areas that could use a little bit more fence reduction, like the Big Sandy River, Soda Lake, and Hoback River areas. And so putting this in the sense of what mule deer are experiencing can give a few insights into where there might actually be more effort deserved. We also wanted to then quantify some of these aspects, the functional attributes. And one thing that we found that was a surprising preliminary result was that we didn't actually find a difference in how animals were moving through the landscape, nor where they were stopping to forage. But we wanted to take this and understand how animals are green wave surfing, which is one of the main functional benefits of mule deer migration. And so we did this with a resource selection function where we were basically looking at used versus available sites within the corridor. And then we also did this looking at the whole corridor. How many fences did a deer cross, and where was she on the green wave throughout her entire migration? And we'll kind of zip through these as I'm running out of time. But the first thing that I wanted to point out is that we found that unmodified fences appear to contribute to deer basically jumping the green wave, going a little bit too fast and moving earlier than when green up is occurring on the landscape. However, despite these best efforts of what they're selecting for, deer that crossed more unmodified fences were late with respect to green up throughout most of their migration. And so these early results point to the idea that fences can actually affect the behaviors that deer are using on the landscape, maybe even getting in the way of foraging behavior, as deer are instead putting a lot of effort into contending with and navigating these barriers. And so by quantifying the functional benefits of migration and the functionality costs of barriers such as fences, we're getting a much clearer sense of how to keep these behaviors on the landscape. And so there are many folks I'd like to thank, but in the interest of time, I'm going to move on through. This is also work that has the unique aspect that it spreads across 4 different units of or regions of Wyoming Game and Fish, and so many of their staff have been hugely helpful. And I'd like to invite any questions if there are any.
Thanks, Luke. We've got plenty of time, folks. You can either raise your hand or put something in the chat box. Or you can think about it for a little bit and we can come back.
Yeah, sounds good. I don't see anything, so.
Thanks, Luke. Oh, there's Matt.
Luke, maybe you can just talk a little bit more about, I mean, there's apparently kind of a little bit of paradox in your findings, right? You didn't find any effect of speed of movement and stopover use before and after the fence removal. So they haven't changed how fast they're going or where they're stopping over. But then you, in terms of what the current fences are now, you have this clear avoidance effects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was careful to put that this is preliminary data, and so to answer a question that just came up in the chat, no, it's not published, and we're still fine-tuning these results. Yeah, so I think this is kind of what Matt is referring to here. So although deer weren't moving faster through the landscape, nor were they really stopping in pronounced different areas within a year, what we do find is that in terms of selection, which is which spaces did they use relative to what was available, deer appear to basically, they want to avoid crossing fences so much. However, they end up basically rushing through areas. And so they showed a much higher selection for early areas with respect to green up. So what I've often heard that referred to as jumping the green wave. And so basically becoming mismatched in the sense of being too early throughout space. But that's a habitat selection framework. And when we put that in terms of habitat use, what we instead found was that deer are still late with respect to green up. So despite selecting given what's available, in terms of what they actually used, they were still late overall. Hopefully that makes a bit more sense, but.
Okay, next up, we have Daniel Reynolds with the University of Wyoming. Oh.
Renee had a question, I think.
Thanks. Sorry, I was just a little late to get the hand up. I just wanted to ask what you're sort of hypothesizing, theorizing why that sort of difference in expectation when the animals are rushing through areas, but not hitting, they're late to the green up.
Yeah, what I've been, thanks, that's a great question.
Yeah.
I think it's something, like I said, we're still kind of working through. What I've been sort of thinking of it as is I'm really curious to try to understand when, animals could either be foraging or they could be traveling. And in this context, what we're sort of understanding this as is that fences might be encouraging more traveling type behavior and less foraging. And so that's, at least for mule deer, that's sort of counter to what a lot of the paradigm is, that fences might, force animals to stay in a spot and maybe forage more intensely. What instead our results are suggesting is that deer are actually prioritizing moving through spaces. Now, why they're late overall, one of the things, these models account for a lot of the phenology that's going on. And so whether it was an early or late spring. And so I think building that nuance into some of these, how did movement rates, stopover selection, building that nuance into some of those models will help kind of bring all these results together. But when we account for those other attributes, it does seem as though they're late with respect to green up simply because, you know, they may actually be getting delayed, but they're trying on a small scale to have kind of a behavioral, you know, behavioral change to, you know, in the area that's available to them. They're trying to select for what's at your earlier green up. So maybe they're trying to compensate for being late overall.
Great, thanks, Luke.
Thanks.
Another question from Jared.
Yeah, I don't know if this is a question, but I want to throw this out there, and I think I've been thinking about this a little bit, and there's been some discussions with some of the folks that I'm around, but a lot of what we're doing, this is kind of a comparison of Luke's work to Hall's work here. So a lot of what we're doing is making the world more permeable so animals have access to habitat to, you know, improve the quality of their habitat or increase carrying capacity. But in other ways, especially the pronghorn context, we're trying to make the landscape permeable so when things are bad, not as many die. Does that make sense? There's like a little difference here, and like we're trying to like improve the permeability to increase access to habitat from kind of like a positive standpoint, but then the other side of this is kind of like increasing permeability so when things get rough, like a bad winter, we're reducing how many die. And I feel like it's a little different way to think about it, and I challenge folks to think about it, and I think even like I know some of my discussions with Game and Fish too, it's like this is just a different way to think about, you know, improving habitat. It's almost like improving habitat sometimes from a positive angle or minimizing the negative. Anyway, I just wanted to throw it out there. If anybody wants to talk about it, we can maybe in some of the other question things, but I think just the comparison of Hall's study to this one is right on point with that kind of vibe.
Thank you for that comment, Jared. Anyone else? Luke, appreciate you fielding the questions. Why don't we go ahead and move on to Daniel Reynolds with the University of Wyoming. Welcome, Daniel.
Hey everybody, my name is Daniel Reynolds. I'm a master's student at the University of Wyoming. I'm working in Derek Scossa's lab on some wildlife-friendly fencing projects. So I wanted to talk a little bit about our projects and the next generation of fencing and livestock, of fencing for livestock and wildlife. So the problem is, as we kind of talked about before, is there's a general blindness of the presence of fencing. It seems like when you're driving down the road, you don't really notice fences unless you're kind of really paying attention. And I think that a lot of people don't even notice them, let alone know that they're a problem. They cause habitat fragmentation, exclusion, interruption of essential movement strategies, and injuries and mortalities. So because they're migratory animals, they really need to be able to move throughout landscapes to use the most productive landscapes while they can. And then these fences are causing barriers and lots of issues for them. Fences are largely unmapped, unregulated, and maintained by private landowners. So that makes it difficult to quantify the problem. We don't really know all the characteristics of all the fences or where they're at. I think about roads that you can kind of drop a pin anywhere on Google Maps and be able to look around and see what the road looks like. But with fences, we don't really know exactly all what's going on there. In response to these problems, there's been wildlife-friendly fences that have been proposed to decrease the negative impacts that are caused by fences. And one thing is they're largely unevaluated for containing domestic livestock and especially sheep. There's a handful of case studies out there that say that the fences work, but there's a general lack of empirical evidence. And the other issue with fences is it's necessary. It's a critical function in livestock production. Besides ag, defining boundaries, keeping people out, keeping animals off the road. It kind of reminds me of the old adage, good fences make good neighbors. There's lots of ways you can interpret that. Keeping your cows off of other people's property, keeping other people's livestock off of your property. So going more into my project, we are partnered with the NRCS in this conservation effects assessment project. Fencing incentive payments for fencing is the second most common practice that the NRCS assists with. So there's lots of money going out for people to build new fence, lots of interest in new fences coming up. So we wanted to look at the efficacy of wildlife-friendly fences for containing domestic livestock and evaluate some of the risk that they pose on wildlife. So one of my studies is a winter open gate study. We have 20 camera locations at 2 different properties. One is the McGuire Ranch, which is about 30 miles north of Laramie. We have 5 cameras up there. That's composed of mainly 4 and 5 strand barbed wire fences, and our interior is wildlife friendly fences. And then we have the LREC location, which has 15 cameras. It's more of that traditional woven wire topped with 1 or 2 strands of barbed wire sheep fencing. So essentially we just open gates, fix them open from December until May. And when livestock aren't out there, we're trying to evaluate if it allows pronghorn to move through these landscapes a little better. Especially with the winter die-off of 2022 and 2023 and the reverse snowpack, this is something that producers could do. Doesn't cost anything. Really, the only extra work is opening the gates at the start of winter and then making sure they're closed. Another thing I wanted to add is we didn't open any gates on perimeter fencing. It's all interior, so there's no issues with trespass or anything like that. It just allows the animals to move a little bit better through the interior fencing of the property. And then another one of my studies is evaluating wildlife friendly fences for containing domestic sheep. So essentially we looked at 9 different designs, 8 recommended by 3 different conservation agencies. We went through a series of blocks. So we had 4 groups of 3 sheep. We would place them in paddocks and intersect the paddocks with wildlife friendly fencing. We designed it so the sheep would deplete the forage and create a pull factor to encourage the sheep to challenge the wildlife friendly fence designs. And we got some interesting results. We had 1 group that crossed 5 of the fences. Only 2 of the individuals ever crossed the fences. The bottom wire height ranged from 10 to 18 inches. One thing that I find really interesting is we achieved high utilization. So all of that second square there is all of the groups except for the group that crossed. So we achieved 82% utilization with those groups and they never crossed. So that kind of indicates that these fence designs could potentially contain sheep at high utilization without crossings. And then another interesting thing is the negative utilization percentage for the group that did cross. So this indicates that the sheep decided to cross the fence regardless of the utilization. So likely other social factors that cause them to cross those fences. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about virtual fencing. We're not currently doing anything with virtual fencing, but it seems to be a really hot topic lately. So virtual fencing kind of emerged in the 80s but the technology wasn't quite there yet. So it kind of disappeared for a while. And then with increased advancement, availability, and affordability of technology, it kind of has reemerged and exploded in recent years. Some of the benefits of virtual fencing is increased control of livestock. So you can go on your computer or your laptop or your phone and draw paddocks and move your livestock where they need to be. So you can influence timing, intensity, duration, and frequency of that stock. It's really flexible with variable conditions such as wildfires and drought. Allows you to move those animals where you may not have been able to move them, restricted by fences prior. And you're allowed to remove some of that interior fencing. That perimeter fence is still typically required, at least in the papers that I've seen so far. And then movement tracking. This is kind of a big thing for livestock side, is you can pull a lot of information off of those GPS points, grazing habits, animal health, and you can track those animals so you don't have to spend a lot of time and energy if they were to get away. Some of the challenges are connectivity, especially in Wyoming. Spotty service and high slopes or trees can interrupt some of that connection and cause issues. So boundaries may not work as well. They have base stations that you can get that can improve that connectivity. And depending on the size of the property, you may need several, which leads me to my next point is it's a pretty significant upfront cost, especially with the low profit margins in the livestock industry. So that's something for producers to consider. There's little training period that it takes that the livestock have to go through, and teaching people to adapt the new software, the new technology may take a little bit of time, but from what I've seen in the papers is it's manageable, and that perimeter fence is still required. So you're able to remove that interior fence, but you still have that perimeter fence, the interior. So in a perfect world, we'd be able to just remove all fences and put these collars on and be able to manage our livestock and allow big game to pass through with ease. But unfortunately, we still need some fences for various reasons. Stepping into the future, we need empirical evidence with fence ecology studies, especially pertaining to containing domestic livestock. There's not much out there on how well these fences work for containing livestock. And I think that's something that if we are able to provide empirical evidence that these fences do or don't work, it would give producers a little bit more comfort when deciding to choose a wildlife friendly fence. And if there is problems, we can go back and fix them so they serve their primary purpose of containing domestic livestock, and then we can ease some of that movement for big game. Increased awareness and concern, again, going back to that blindness. I don't think people really understand the impacts of fences or even notice fences too much. So just kind of increasing that may help boost some of these projects. Integration of new technology. Seems like every night there's a new advancement in technology, and bringing that into this field could definitely provide benefits. And then exploring innovative fencing tools, options, and technologies that are effective for producers and meet wildlife needs. So I just kind of want to drive that point home. Effective for producers, we have to remember that these fences must serve their primary purpose, and then we can go in and meet wildlife needs. And that's all I got.
Daniel, really appreciate that. We've got maybe about a minute for any questions. Bill.
Yeah, it's curious on the negative utilization of sheep. Do you think that's just a behavioral thing for a certain percentage of the sheep behaviorally are more apt to try to test the fences, or were there events occurred that caused them to move, outside of the forage amount?
It's looking like it's more of a social thing. So as you can see in that diagram, those testing blocks were kind of next to each other, and there are certain individuals that seem to have figured it out or had previously learned how to cross underneath fences, and then once they crossed, they would go to our welded wire gate and lay next to that next group.
More question from Brock, and then we'll move on.
This question might be a little bit beyond what Daniel was focusing on here, but my initial question or my initial thought that comes up when we talk about virtual fencing is the adoption rate and the acceptance within the agricultural community. Anybody here, or Daniel, do you have a sense from conversations about what that looks like? Or I mean, is it something where we foresee that being something that is gains acceptance and producers are willing and ready to adopt, or do we foresee some really big challenges on that front?
I wouldn't be able to say for certain. What I've seen is there's been a huge uptake in it, and talking to people, there's lots of interest in it. But I don't know if anybody else here could give a little bit better answer than that.
This is Shalise with the Western Landowners Alliance. In my experience with cattle producers, not so much sheep producers, is that when there's funding available to upgrade your fence, they don't really mind if it's wildlife friendly or not. They seem to take the money because fences are really expensive. But I'm curious if Brian is still on and he could sort of give some, I don't know, any sentiments that he hears from his staff in regards to the cost share and the interest from landowners through the NRCS.
I am on Shalise, but I think John will be talking a little bit about virtual fence and NRCS later. I'll let him maybe catch that then.
In the interest of time, folks, we'll probably move on, but let's hold on to these virtual fence questions for the discussion at the end of the summit. So appreciate those thought-provoking ideas.